Hi everyone. Now we're moving on to part 2 of our topic for this week, individual and group interventions with socio-emotional and cognitive challenges of older adults, especially around depression, anxiety, and dementia. And we're going to be talking specifically this time around about group interventions and group work with older adults. This slide has a link to a very basic video. It's relatively short, and it is describing what group work with older adults might look like. Developing knowledge of and skills in working with older adults and or their family members and caregivers in groups is an essential part of the repertoire of practice approaches needed by a gerontological social worker. Group work utilizes both the therapeutic skills of the social worker and the power of group dynamics, the psychosocial forces that occur when 3 or more individuals interact with each other around a common goal or purpose. So last time we talked about some of the traditional approaches of treatment and intervention options that are specifically evidence-based approaches to working with older adults. And some of those approaches can be incorporated into group work with older adults as well. And that will be important to remember as we move forward in talking about different types of groups. This slide shows different types of groups, some of which you may not be quite as familiar with. It has kind of a combination. There's therapy groups that are separated out from the other types of groups, which are maybe fall under a different category of support groups rather than a therapy group. And so I'll just go through these very briefly. A reality or orientation group is one that is typically connected to maybe current events or something that is meant to orient people to their environment, orient people to time, place, person, those kinds of things, and maybe the weather, things to help sort of reorient someone. So this is something that might be a good option for working with older people with dementia, is a reality orientation group. Remotivation has to do with bringing together a group of people that maybe have a common interest or are open to learning something new, maybe a new hobby or a new activity that they can be engaged in, learning something new, something that will help to re-engage them with maybe a past interest or to reconnect them in a new way to experience new activities or new things that they might like to learn more about, and therefore giving them a sense of inspiration to try new things and to remotivate them, like the term says. Social recreational groups are aimed at bringing people together to actively engage in a specific activity. It could be an exercise group, it could be you know, where people go out for an outing, maybe like a coffee clutch or a walking club or some kind of activity, maybe a book club, something like that, where it is a group and there is some goal of a specific activity and giving the opportunity to recreate and socialize with other people and have camaraderie and companionship and you know, and just have connection with other people. Support groups are typically peer-led, so they are usually formed around a cause or a specific purpose. Maybe, you know, it could be something around a mental health issue or a physical issue or a common interest or relationship issues or things like that, but they are not therapeutic in nature in the sense of how we may think of it from a clinical perspective. They're generally peer-led or lay-led groups facilitated by non-professionals. They may or may not have a structure and format to them, but they are geared around a specific kind of reason for coming together that's specific to a cause. Self-help groups can be very similar. They are also not facilitated necessarily by a professional. They are cause specific with you know, a group of people that are experiencing the same situation or the same issue, and they are voluntary and intended to provide some type of informal support for whatever the purpose of the group is about. So you might think of an example would be like an AA group would be considered a self-help group. An example of a support group might be like a caregiver support group for maybe family members who are providing caregiving to their older loved one. A social recreational group, I think I gave some examples of those. Remotivation group might be, you know, I gave some examples of that, and of the reality orientation group I gave some examples of as well. So going back down the list, sorry, I kind of went all over the place there, but a therapy group is clinical by nature and typically facilitated by a professional, and again is focused on a specific cause or issue, and typically implements some therapeutic techniques from some of those that are based on some of those traditional therapeutic interventions that we talked about in the first part of this week's lecture materials. So an example of a therapy group might be a DBT group, the Dialectical Behavioral Therapy Group, or you might have a therapy group with you know, folks that are experiencing depression or anxiety, or you know, maybe some type of specific trauma. You might have a group that is specific for veterans that have experienced combat trauma or have PTSD related to combat. So those are very specific issues being experienced by specific populations, or you know, wherever there's that common link between the members with a purpose to address the issues that they're experiencing. A psychosocial group would be one that is aimed at helping to address psychosocial needs, so dealing with internal thoughts and feelings and socializing and connecting with others, with peers that have a similar experience, and kind of learning to cope with those challenges. And it may or may not be led by a professional. Oftentimes they are, but oftentimes they're not. The same with psychoeducational groups, which are typically skill building groups where you're bringing people together to learn how to, or relearn sometimes, specific skills, and skills that will be beneficial to them to help resolve issues or move forward with coping, learning coping skills, and change, and figuring out how to come to terms with major life transitions or crises and that sort of thing. So those are some of the main types of groups that we see. One of the biggest things that we want to remember too is that even though these are kind of mixed up on the slide, if we were to put these under umbrella terms or umbrella types of groups, we'd have the therapeutic clinical types of groups, and then we'd have the more supportive types of groups. And the therapeutic groups that are more clinical in focus, that are facilitated by professionals, those groups are usually closed groups, meaning that only a certain number of people can participate in the group, and they all have to basically be experiencing the same issue. And the other thing specific to those therapeutic groups is that they are typically time limited. So it might be an 8-week closed therapeutic group, or it might be a 16-week group, something of that nature. Like DBT is typically, I believe, a 16-week series of sessions. So it's time limited and closed. The other umbrella of groups, the more support groups or psychosocial, psychoeducational groups, self-help groups, social recreational groups, those are usually open, meaning there's not necessarily a cap on the number of participants necessarily, and they're open to people. They can come and go. You know, some weeks they might participate, some weeks they might not. So there's not necessarily an expectation of continuous participation. And they are usually ongoing, so there's not a time limit to it. It's not something that has a starting, well, I mean, it has a starting point, but it doesn't necessarily have an ending point. It's just something that will always continue, and so people are welcome to join in as they see fit and as their needs, you know, require. Okay, so some of the characteristics of group work with older adults include things like the need to be aware of and accommodate for physical and sensory limitations. So if people are hard of hearing, or if their vision is impaired in some way, you want, or their mobility is impaired in some way, you want to make sure to have your environment set up accordingly to accommodate for those needs. Make sure that you know, if speakers are needed, that the volume is set right, or to help ensure that people have their glasses or their walkers or their hearing aids and the like, so that they can actively participate. The group leader may need to take an active role throughout the group process, not meaning that they might not be relinquishing leadership or direction to other group members. So depending on your role as the facilitator, you need to make sure you're prepared for whatever that leadership role or your participation in the group process may be. The group leader may also need to devote extra time to developing individual relationships with group members. And sometimes that means you kind of have to sell the group to them, kind of court them or coax them into coming, in the hopes that once they're there, they will not want to be there, but they'll be more likely to participate actively and be engaged. And that can sometimes be helpful to have that one-on-one connection or invitation to link people into the group. If you rely on just, you know, word of mouth or you know, disseminating information about a group, that may or may not attract people into the group who could benefit from it, but that one-on-one personal connection sometimes makes the biggest difference. And another characteristic of group work with older adults includes the pace of the group. It might be a little slower than groups conducted with other age groups, so you just want to keep that in mind, that this is probably not something that's going to go fast or be rushed. So plan accordingly and set your agendas accordingly. Some of the participants might tend to be a little bit more passive, or they might get preoccupied with their own challenges or issues that they're dealing with. There might be some level of discomfort sharing in a group setting, and sometimes that's a generational thing. Sometimes it's an individual personality thing, but all of those barriers kind of need to be taken into consideration and might contribute to the pace of the group as well. So extra time for building trust and relationship and that rapport can go a long way in planning for a successful group. It's also important to remember how dynamic and interactive the group becomes. That's a function of the purpose of the group and the physical and mental health of its members. So depending on the day, depending on how they're feeling on that particular group day, or what's been going on with them, and in conjunction with their natural personalities or communication styles, that's going to impact the group dynamic and how people relate to each other within the group and how they interact with each other. And so that will be something that as a facilitator you will need to be aware of as well. Okay, the last thing on this slide on the right hand column says that there's a video here for you to watch, and I really want you to make sure to watch this video. It is, I think, especially helpful to social workers in their professional development for skill building and just knowing what to expect when working with groups of older people, especially if you haven't done them before. The piece of this video I want you to watch starts at the 41-minute mark. So this is a video that has different segments to it, and the segment on group work with older people starts at the 41-minute mark, and it includes a social work practicum student conducting a group and talking about that experience before and after the group. And so some of the things you might want to just look out for and think about as you're watching it. It's relatively short, it's not that long, but I want you to think about some of the things I mentioned about these types of groups and see if you can identify what type of group this social work student was leading, and think about what kind of wording did she use? How did she title the group? How did she advertise for it? How did she get people to come? What tactics did she use to recruit people? And how did she accommodate for any of those physical or mental challenges that people might have had in the group? You might notice something with relation to hearing. You might notice something in relation to reading and maybe some language challenges. So I want you to pay attention to some of those things. There's also some things to look at with regard to cultural pieces and religion and language. I think I mentioned that. And what about things like food or drink? How were those incorporated into the group? What kind of format was used? How did the group kind of flow? What was the plan for that? What was the purpose of the group? How did people benefit from participating in this group that you watch in this video? And what was the role of the social worker? What were some of the things that were shared related to similarities of experiences of the group members? And what things were supportive or educational? Did you see anything related to giving ideas or referrals or resources or anything like that within the group process itself? So please watch this short video. It's really a good one, and I hope that you can connect the links between what you view in that video clip and some of the information provided on this slide. Now I'd like to give you some tips for working with groups of older adults. Some of these may have been mentioned already, but one of the strategies you want to use is some creative marketing tools. So even as social workers, we do have to think about marketing techniques and strategies and how to target an audience and recruit them to our groups or our activities that we want to engage in. So get creative about marketing your group to older adults and think carefully about the incentives you can use to bring these people into your groups. Transportation and food are usually very helpful kinds of things to offer. Incorporate some kind of physical activity into the group if possible. It can be helpful to consider making physical activity part of your group work with older adults. This kind of activity has been shown to be helpful in keeping the people in the group physically mobile and keep their attention and help them be more engaged in the group process. Remember to treat everyone in the group with respect. I know that sounds like basic common sense, but treat the people in your groups with respect. Do not infantilize them or talk down to them or talk to them like they're babies, or be age appropriate and respectful. Add appropriate humor to the group process. You don't need to be serious all the time. Appropriate use of humor can be an effective therapeutic tool. Encourage sharing. So encourage people in the group to share their life stories. Asking people to talk about their families and their work histories, or even to share photos of their friends and family, those can be a great way to honor their history and helps create bonds between people. So encourage sharing of their experiences and life stories. Form groups where people congregate. Community centers, senior centers, nursing homes, coffee shops, places like that are oftentimes, open and welcome to having older adults or any group of individuals meet on a regular basis. And oftentimes they're eager to have fresh faces and new activities to supplement whatever they may be doing already. Practice active listening. Some of the group work you do might not be only with older adults themselves. It might be with caregivers, or it might be with staff or coworkers, or people that you might be working with indirectly or directly, in the community, maybe a task force or a coalition or something. So you want to model and actively listen to people participating in groups or participating in these efforts, and use those active listening skills that you've been learning about and practicing. And maybe some of them might want to follow your lead and help with some kind of discussion group or some type of a support group or something as well, and you can build and branch out and offer more groups to people in need or who could benefit from them by modeling how that group work might look. So what are the benefits of group work with older adults? So increasing socialization or decreasing social isolation and loneliness is a big part of, or one of the biggest benefits of group work with older people. And this can help decrease depression and anxiety. It can help improve affect or mood or attitudes and outlook. It can decrease risks for suicide or self-medication and substance use, and it can decrease the use of other illicit drugs or alcohol as well. So socialization offers exposure or being around other people and interacting with others, having that social connectedness and opportunity to engage. And another big part of that is getting people distracted from themselves. So instead of constantly worrying or dwelling on their own issues, they can be engaged with other people and sort of have that distraction so that they're not just sitting with their own stuff all of the time. And it's also a way to develop and practice ongoing social skills. And all of that has been shown to be very helpful to use to older adults that are participating in groups. Networking is also a huge benefit. So developing a web of relationships and sources of support and feedback, and becoming familiar with other community resources or links to places that might be helpful, outside of the group. Group solidarity, that sense of belonging, that sense of purpose, that is also a huge benefit of group work for older adults. Efficiency. So that basically just means that by facilitating groups with older people, you have the ability to serve more people at one time, especially in a congregate setting. That can be very useful. So you're kind of, you have more time for other things because you're dealing with a group of people rather than one at a time. And that can be very cost effective too. Group work can be very effective. There is actually some mixed literature on this as far as the empirical basis of benefits for group work with older adults. Some research says that it doesn't make a difference that much, and other research says that it makes a big difference. But most of the research ultimately says that group work is better than no treatment at all. So if people aren't getting any kind of individual support or one-on-one opportunities or resources, definitely group work is better than nothing else. And at minimal, it meets people's psychosocial needs and helps develop coping skills. Benefits of groups with older adults can also provide consensual validation, so an affirmation that they are not alone, that there's a sense of normalcy to how they feel and think about whatever they're experiencing, that other people get it because they're dealing with the same kinds of things. And that sense of affirmation and sense of not being alone is huge for a lot of people. A huge benefit to group work is consensual validation. Another benefit is that it can also reestablish meaningful life roles. So focusing on strengths and assets and past and present capacities, and not focusing on like disabilities or limitations or functional challenges or mobility issues, those kinds of things. It can really help people feel like they still have a sense of purpose and meaning and that they're fulfilling their life roles. It's an opportunity to share wisdom and expertise through their life experiences and insights that they have gained throughout their lives from those life experiences, as well as reaffirming lifelong competencies, and that helps to increase their self-esteem and their confidence, and can therefore affect their mood and affect and their overall mental health. And lastly, one of the big benefits of group work with older adults is the flexibility and diversity of the groups, meaning that there's a versatility of the types of groups that we talked about a few slides back, and the settings in which groups can be led in can vary, and so you have a lot of room to experiment and kind of, you know, try different things and add variety to the group settings and whatnot. So that can be an added benefit for some of these groups that we facilitate with older people. So when is it not a good idea to run a group with older folks? So some of the times when you don't want to facilitate a group with older folks or have older adults participate in a group might be when there are practical barriers. If there are issues of frailty or mobility restrictions and the facility or the setting in which you're going to hold the group is not accessible, then either those folks are not going to be able to participate, or you might need to reconsider the location of the group. If there are language barriers, that's not going to be beneficial to certain group members. That'll just be more stressful or, you know, frustrating for them, so that wouldn't be a good fit. If there are major issues with hearing loss or communication issues, and there's not a way to accommodate for them, then that might be something to consider not having the group or not having people participate in the group if you cannot accommodate for those practical barriers. If there is disruptive behavior by participants of the group, if there are, you know, for example, people that wander, or if they're combative or aggressive, or if they're very, you know, socially inappropriate, like using racial slurs or, you know, being very negative towards group members, that kind of disruptive behavior is not going to be conducive to a successful group with older adults. So folks that are engaging in disruptive behaviors are probably not good candidates for group work. And certain personality types actually may not be good or good to include in a group setting with older adults. So people who are very narcissistic don't make for good group members. If there are severe behavior problems, you know, agitation, aggression, something very disruptive or dangerous, that's not going to be helpful. Oftentimes having people who are kind of hypochondriacs is not helpful to the group process. It's hard for them to see things from different perspectives, and often will dwell on their own things, and they are not always able to move on from one thing to the next, and so that can be very challenging. If someone is in acute crisis, that's probably also not necessarily a great time to have them participate in a group. So if they're terminally ill, or if they just have experienced a major personal trauma and are in the acute stage of that trauma, or the acute or experiencing, you know, the acuteness of the loss of a loved one. Not that those aren't good causes to have groups for, but you have to be careful of the timing of those experiences in order for folks to really reap the benefits of the group work itself. So you want to take all of those things into consideration. Groups can be great, but there are also certain times and places and people that maybe group work is not conducive to the situation. All right, so this slide talks about the group process itself. There's kind of two different ways of thinking about this, and if you've taken the groups class already, this might look a little familiar, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but basically we want to just recognize that One way of thinking about the group process is that there's 3 stages or phases of the group: the engagement phase, the working phase, and the termination phase. And basically the engagement phase is the beginning part of the group process. Sometimes it's kind of the first step and includes the planning phase, which might actually be more like a pre-engagement phase, but it's when the planning is really setting up, defining the purpose of the group, the structure and plan of the group, kind of how the logistics of the group are going to work, and the benefits of the group, what are the expectations, that sort of thing, and establishing the group rules, including confidentiality, and what happens in the group stays in the group. All of those kinds of things are happening during that engagement phase. And then the working phase is sort of the middle phase. So when the actual work or tasks are being done, establishing the group norms happens during this time. There's more member-to-member communication and less member-to-leader communication. And during this working phase, you see a growing sense of cohesion among the group members and participants. And there's a beginning experience sometimes with conflict as members juggle or kind of vet themselves for different power or status within the group. And that's kind of just a natural part of a group process. And leaders need to encourage participation and clarify communication between group members during that time so things can run smoothly. And then the final stage, or the end phase of the group process, is the termination phase. And that's when the group has completed all of its planned activities and or accomplished its goals. And that's, more applicable when it's a closed group and time limited as opposed to open-ended and an open group. But the process of ending a group includes sharing feelings and identifying personal or social changes that have occurred as a result of involvement in the group. So praise for the learning of a new skill is commonly done during this termination phase of the group process, and providing ways to see how to use them in the future or put those skills, how to apply them down the road, those coping skills or whatever, is also kind of comes to culmination during that termination phase. So everything that I talked about in that model of group processing with engagement, working, and termination phases fit into the other common model of group processing that you are probably more familiar with, that was set forth by Bruce Tuckman, and that's the 4-stage model of group development, the forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning stages of the group process. So there's a lot of overlap in this. It's just something to be aware of. This is a normal experience of group work, including group work with older adults. Okay, so that was a lot of information thrown at you in a short period of time, but basically when talking about group work with older adults, the takeaway points I want you to have and remember are that group work offers an efficient and effective way to help a large number of people than is possible through individual intervention alone. And the basic principles of the group approach can be applied in flexible ways in diverse settings. So as a facilitator or somebody who's planning a group with older adults, there's a lot of nuances to keep in mind and to consider when doing that, but know that you have a lot of different ways and modalities and places from which to choose from in order to make your group work with older adults successful.